My name is Rachel. I'm 36, and I've spent the last 11 years working in commercial finance, structuring loans for people who buy buildings for a living. I know how ownership works down to the last decimal point, whose name is on a deed, whose signature is on a mortgage, and the difference between the word ours and the word mine when a family says them in the same sentence like they mean the same thing. They don't. So when my parents called me on a Tuesday evening and told me almost casually that they'd decided to let your brother move into the house since he needs it more, I should have asked one question before I said anything else. Whose name is actually on the deed? I already knew the answer. I was the one who'd put it there. And my parents were about to find out, in front of my brother, in front of the family, exactly what that meant. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you've ever built something with your own hands and watched someone else try to hand it to somebody else, this story is for you. Drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happened at that house is going to stay with you for a long time. Let me back up, because you need to understand what that house actually was before you understand what they tried to do with it. 8 years ago, my parents were about to lose the home I grew up in. Not a mansion, not anything fancy. A modest 3-bedroom ranch house in a working-class neighborhood outside Columbus, the house where I did my homework at the kitchen table and where my father taught me to change a tire in the driveway. My dad had been a machinist for 30 years at a plant that closed without warning, taking his pension promises with it. My mother worked part-time at a school cafeteria. Between his layoff and a medical bill from my mother's knee surgery, they'd fallen 4 months behind on the mortgage, and the bank had already sent the second warning letter. I was 28 at the time. 3 years into my finance career, unmarried, no kids, renting a 1-bedroom apartment I could easily have upgraded from, but chose not to because I was saving. I'd always been the saver in the family. My brother Danny, 2 years younger than me, was the opposite. Generous, likable, terrible with money. The kind of person who'd buy a round of drinks for people he'd met an hour earlier and then ask to borrow gas money the next week. Everyone loved Danny. Danny made rooms brighter. I made spreadsheets. When my parents called me crying about the foreclosure notice, I didn't hesitate. I had $94,000 saved, most of it earmarked for a down payment on my own place eventually. I used it instead to pay off the remaining balance on their mortgage in full, not a loan. I want to be precise about this because precision is the entire point of this story. It was not a loan, because a loan implies repayment terms, and there were none discussed, none written down, nothing beyond my mother hugging me in the kitchen and saying through tears, "We'll make this right, Rachel. I promise you, we'll make this right." Here's the part that matters. I didn't just hand them a check. I'd spent 3 years in commercial real estate finance by then, and I knew exactly how these situations tend to go bad. Not because anyone starts out dishonest, but because memories soften over time and generosity gets rewritten in people's heads into something smaller and less important than it actually was. I'd watched it happen to a colleague of mine who'd helped her parents with a property and ended up with nothing to show for it but a decade of resentment and an empty bank account. So instead of simply paying off the mortgage and letting my parents keep the house in their names, I structured it properly. I paid off their existing mortgage balance directly to the bank, and in exchange, my parents transferred the deed into my name, with a life estate clause allowing them to live in the house for as long as they wanted, rent-free for the rest of their lives. It was drawn up by an actual real estate attorney, filed with the county recorder, notarized, the whole process. My parents' names came off the deed. Mine went on. They kept the right to live there. I owned the house. At the time, nobody thought this was strange. My father actually cried with relief and told me I'd saved the family. My mother said the same thing 3 different ways over the course of that year. Danny hugged me at Thanksgiving and told everyone at the table that his sister was the reason they still had a roof over their heads. It felt, for a little while, like the best decision I'd ever made. I paid the property taxes every year since. I paid for a new roof 4 years ago when a storm tore through half the shingles. I paid for the furnace replacement 2 winters ago when it finally gave out in January. I never lived there. I never asked to. I let my parents live in a house I owned because I loved them, and because giving them stability felt more important than owning an asset I'd never personally use. I want you to hold all of that in your mind, because it's about to become relevant in a way I never saw coming. Danny's life, over those same 8 years, did not go the way anyone hoped. He went through 3 jobs, 2 serious relationships that ended badly, and, about 18 months ago, a divorce that left him without the apartment he and his ex-wife had shared. He moved back in in with our parents temporarily, which quietly became permanently, sleeping in what used to be my childhood bedroom, working inconsistent hours at a car dealership, still likable, still the golden child, still somehow never quite landing anywhere solid. I didn't resent any of that. People struggle. I wasn't angry that Danny needed a place to stay. What I didn't know, what nobody told me, was that over the last year and a half, my parents had started talking to Danny about the house as though it were theirs to give him. I found out by accident, the way you find out most things that people didn't want you to find out. My mother called me in March, warm and casual, the way she always is right before she asks for something. Rachel, honey, we've been thinking. Danny's really struggling and we're not getting any younger. We think it makes sense for him to take over the house eventually, so he has somewhere stable, somewhere he can really call his own. We wanted to talk to you about maybe transferring things over to him. I sat very still with the phone against my ear, doing the thing I do at work when a client says something that doesn't match the paperwork in front of me, going quiet, listening for the gap between what's being said and what's actually true. Mom, I said carefully, the house isn't in your name. It's in mine. It has been for 8 years. There was a pause, just a little too long to be comfortable. Well, we know that, sweetheart, but it's really always been the family home. We just assumed that eventually it would go to whoever needed it most. And right now, that's Danny. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think some of you will recognize it. It wasn't rage. It was something colder and stranger. The specific disorientation of realizing that a fact you thought was settled, documented, and legally uncontestable had somehow, in someone else's mind, become negotiable. As if 8 years of tax bills and roof repairs and a notarized deed transfer were just a story I'd been telling myself. And the real story, the one my parents had apparently been telling each other and Danny, was different. I'm not transferring the deed to Danny, I said. We're not saying right now, my mother said quickly. We just wanted to open the conversation. I told her I needed to think about it, which was a lie. There was nothing to think about, but I wanted to see how far this had already gone before I said anything more permanent. That instinct turned out to be the most important decision I made in this entire story. 3 weeks later, my mother called again and invited me to Sunday dinner at the house. Just a normal family dinner. Nothing special. I should tell you, because you already know how these things go, that nothing special is almost never nothing special. I'd learned that lesson from enough family gatherings to know better, but I went anyway, partly because I wanted answers, and partly because some quiet, stubborn part of me still believed that if I just sat across from my parents and asked clearly enough, they'd hear how wrong this was. I got to the house at 6. Danny's car was in the driveway, parked in the spot closest to the door, the spot my father used to park in for 30 years. Something about that small detail bothered me before I'd even walked inside, though I couldn't yet say why. Dinner started normally enough. Pot roast, my mother's usual sides, small talk about Danny's job at the dealership, which he described with more optimism than the actual numbers probably supported. It was somewhere around the second helping of mashed potatoes that my father cleared his throat in the particular way he does before saying something he's rehearsed. Rachel, we wanted to talk to you about something as a family, he said. We've been talking to a friend of mine, Gary, who used to do some real estate work. He said that with the house already essentially functioning as Danny's home, since he lives here full time now, it would make sense to formalize that. Gary said something about a quitclaim deed, said it's a pretty simple process. We just need you to sign. A quitclaim deed. My father had gone and consulted someone, not a licensed attorney, a friend who used to do some real estate work, which is the exact same category of person as Uncle Rick from every cautionary story I'd ever heard, specifically to figure out the mechanism by which they could take my name off a deed I'd paid $94,000 in 8 years of taxes and repairs to hold. You've been talking to someone about transferring my property, I said, without talking to me first. We were going to talk to you, my mother said. That's what tonight is. We're talking to you. You already talked to Gary about how to do it. That's not talking to me. That's planning around me. Danny, who'd been quiet through most of this, finally spoke, and his voice had an edge to it I wasn't used to hearing directed at me. Rachel, come on, you don't even live here. You have your own place in the city, your own life. I'm the one who's actually here every day. Doesn't it make more sense for the house to belong to whoever's actually using it? I bought this house, I said, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. I paid off the mortgage in full. I put the deed in my name with an attorney. It's recorded with the county, and I've paid every property tax bill and every major repair on it for 8 years. It doesn't belong to whoever's using it. It belongs to whoever's name is on the recorded deed, and that's me. Nobody's saying you didn't help, my father said. And there it was, the word help, doing the same work it always does in my family, shrinking an act of complete financial rescue down into something small and interchangeable, the linguistic equivalent of taking a $94,000 check and calling it a favor. But it's been 8 years, Rachel. Things change. Danny needs stability. You're doing fine on your own. I'm doing fine because I saved for years and made careful decisions. I said, that's not a reason to take an asset away from me. That's the opposite of a reason. My mother's eyes were wet now, the way they always get right before the conversation shifts from logic to guilt. We just thought since we're getting older, and since this has always felt like the family home, that we could all agree together on what happens to it. We didn't think you'd be this upset. I'm not upset that Danny needs somewhere to live, I said. I'm upset that the plan for solving that involved a quitclaim deed drafted by a guy named Gary, discussed among the three of you before I was ever brought into the conversation, aimed at a piece of property I legally own. Danny pushed his chair back slightly, arms crossed. This is exactly why nobody wants to bring stuff like this to you. You turn it into a legal argument instead of just being family about it. I sat with that for a second because I want to be honest. It stung more than the quitclaim deed did, being family about it, as if owning something you paid for and declining to give it away on request was a character flaw, as if the 8 years of silent, unglamorous financial responsibility I'd carried for this house, years nobody had thanked me for beyond a hug at Thanksgiving, meant less than Danny's 2 years of living in it. I need everyone to understand something clearly, I said. And I said it the way I talk in closing meetings at work. Level, unhurried, the voice that doesn't need volume because the facts are already doing the work. This house is legally mine, not symbolically, not sentimentally, legally. I am not signing a quitclaim deed. I am not transferring ownership to Danny. And I want to be honest that this conversation tonight has changed something for me, because I now know that behind my back, the three of you had already been planning how to take something away from me without asking. Here's what I did next, and I want to explain it carefully, because I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because it was the only responsible thing left to do, given what I'd just learned. I didn't sign anything at that table. I finished dinner in a silence that felt heavier than any conversation, thanked my mother for the meal because some habits don't disappear even when everything else has, and drove home. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney, not a friend of a friend, an actual licensed attorney with a real office, and asked her to pull the current recorded deed and confirm exactly what my rights were and what my parents' life estate did and did not entitle them to do. She confirmed what I already knew. The house was mine, fully and legally, and the life estate my parents held only gave them the right to live there. It gave them no ownership stake, no right to transfer or encumber the property, and absolutely no authority to negotiate a transfer to Danny without my consent as the title holder. Any quitclaim deed would have required my signature, which meant legally, nothing they discussed with Gary could have happened without me. But morally, they'd already decided I should be the last to know and the easiest to pressure. I also asked her something else, something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since dinner. I asked what would happen, hypothetically, if I ever decided to sell the property, given the life estate. She explained that a life estate can, in some circumstances, be negotiated, bought out, or, if the life tenant is willing, voluntarily terminated, but that as the remainder owner, I retained significant rights over the property regardless. I didn't ask this question because I planned to sell the house out from under my parents. I asked it because I needed to know, for the first time in 8 years, exactly how much power I actually had, because I'd just learned that the people I trusted most had spent months trying to find a way around it. I didn't go back to that house with anger. I went back 2 weeks later with a folder. I asked my parents and Danny to sit down together. The same table, the same chairs. I placed 3 things on the table: a copy of the original recorded deed with my name on it, a printed summary of every tax payment and repair invoice I'd paid over 8 years totaling just over $31,000 beyond the original $94,000, and a letter from my attorney confirming in plain language exactly what the life estate did and did not allow. I'm not here to punish anyone, I said. I'm here to be completely clear one time, so there's never confusion about this again. This house is mine. I bought it, I hold the deed, and I've paid to maintain it for 8 years without asking for anything back because I loved this family and I wanted you to have stability. That's not up for renegotiation, and it was never something that required a family meeting with a man named Gary to decide. My father looked at the deed copy for a long time without speaking. My mother started to cry. But this time I didn't fill the silence to comfort her, because I'd learned that comforting her silence in these moments was exactly how 8 years of ownership had almost quietly become Danny's living room. Danny was the one who finally spoke. "So, what happens to me?" "Nothing changes for you today," I said. "You can keep living here. I'm not taking that away from you, and I'm not taking it away from Mom and Dad either. The life estate stands exactly as it always has. But I need you all to understand that this house is not a resource to be redistributed based on who needs it most in a given year. It's an asset I own, and any future decision about it, selling it, transferring it, anything, is going to be mine to make with proper legal counsel, not a family vote taken without me in the room." "That feels cold," my mother said quietly. "It felt colder finding out you'd already talked to someone about taking it from me before you talked to me at all," I said. Nobody had an answer for that. It's been 5 months since that dinner. Things are not warm between us, but they are honest, which is new, and which I've come to think matters more than warmth ever did. My parents still live in the house. Danny still lives there too, and I haven't asked him to leave, because I meant what I said. I'm not interested in punishing him for needing a place to stay. What I am no longer willing to do is let family be used as the reason ownership gets treated as optional, or as a word that quietly means everything except the part where I get any say. My father called me a month ago, alone, without my mother on the line, and said something I think about often. He said, "I think we got so used to you taking care of things that we stopped seeing it as something you did for us. We started thinking of it as just how things were." I told him I appreciated him saying that. I also told him it didn't change anything about the deed, and he said he understood. Danny and I talk less than we used to. I think some part of him is still waiting for me to feel guilty enough to change my mind. And I don't think that day is coming. I've made peace with that. Here's what I learned from a house I never even got to live in. The people who love you can still, without ever meaning to become villains, start treating what you built as something that was always theirs to redistribute, especially if you built it quietly, without asking for credit, the way I always have. Owning something isn't selfish. Refusing to give it away on request isn't cold. And a boundary drawn with a deed and an attorney's letter is no less real than one drawn with a raised voice. It's just harder to argue with, which is exactly why I chose it. I still own that house. My name is still the only one on the recorded deed. And the next time anyone in my family wants to have a conversation about what happens to it, they know now that the conversation starts with me, not with Gary. If you've ever built something with your own hands and watched someone try to quietly hand it to someone else, you know exactly how.